in the highlands of what is now northern Ethiopia, where the air is thin and cool even in the middle of summer, and where the earth rises in great step terraces toward a sky that seems closer than anywhere else on earth. There once stood a city whose name was spoken with reverence from the markets of Alexandria to the spice ports of southern Arabia. The city was called Aksum, and for many centuries, it was one of the four great powers of the world. That is how a Roman diplomat described it. Writing somewhere in the 3rd century of the Common Era for great powers, he said, and he named them, Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. He wrote the name without explanation, as one writes the name of something too obvious to require introduction. And yet today, most people who walk past its ruins have never heard of it. They pass the great stone pillars still standing in the highland wind, and they do not always know what they are passing through. This is the story of that kingdom, not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as a civilization that bent the arc of an entire continent and left its mark on the world in ways that have never fully faded. Let us begin at the beginning, which is always the hardest place to begin, because beginnings are rarely clean. Long before the city of Aksum became an empire, the highlands of the Horn of Africa were home to people who had already built something remarkable. By the 1st millennium before the Common Era, perhaps earlier, the evidence is not always precise. There were kingdoms in this region that traded across the Red Sea, that worked iron, that carved inscriptions into stone in a script that ran from right to left, borrowed from the Semitic languages of South Arabia. These early polities, sometimes gathered under the name DDMT, are not well understood. What survives of them is fragmentary, a few obelisk fragments, some animal carvings, traces of terraced agriculture that transformed the hillsides into something almost otherworldly when you look at them from a distance. Great green stairways climbing toward the clouds. What we know is that by the time Aksum begins to appear in the written record in Greek periplus texts, in fragments of inscriptions, in the accounts of merchants who sailed the Red Sea, it had already absorbed and transformed whatever came before it. It was not born suddenly. It grew. The city of Aksum sat in the Tigray plateau at an elevation of roughly 2,000 meters. Around it, the land was generous in a way that favored accumulation. The rains came reliably enough to support agriculture. The soil was deep and dark in the valleys. Grain could be grown, cattle kept, honey gathered from the acacia trees that dotted the lower slopes. And most importantly, Aksum sat at the meeting point of routes, not just the famous Red Sea trade, but inland routes that brought ivory and gold and obsidian and enslaved people from the deeper interior of Africa, products that the Mediterranean world could not get enough of and would pay extraordinary prices to obtain. Ivory, above all, was Aksum's great currency with the world. The elephant populations of the Horn of Africa were vast in those centuries, and Aksumite hunters and traders moved through a network that reached hundreds of miles into what is now Sudan, Ethiopia, and beyond. The ivory was gathered, transported north, and eventually loaded onto ships at ports on the Red Sea coast, most famously at a port called Adulis, which sat on the edge of what is now Eritrea, a low and dusty place in contrast to the cool highlands of the capital, but a place of extraordinary commercial energy, where Greek, Arab, Indian, and African merchants moved through narrow lanes smelling of salt water and dried fish and foreign spices. Adulis was, in many ways, Aksum's face to the world. Ships came from Roman Egypt, from the Indian subcontinent, from the frankincense coasts of Arabia. They brought wine in great clay amphorae, iron tools, bolts of cloth, copper and brass and glass. They left with ivory and gold and tortoiseshell, and the resins that Romans burned in their temples and on their funeral pyres. The exchange was ancient and continuous, and it made Aksum rich in a way that is difficult to fully imagine now. Standing in those same highlands where the wind still moves through the eucalyptus trees and the stone obelisks still cast their shadows across the earth, those obelisks, the great stelae of Aksum, are perhaps the most immediately visible sign that something extraordinary once happened here. They rise from the ground in the old royal cemetery, some fallen, some standing, carved from single pieces of granite in the form of many-storied buildings, with false windows and doors and decorative beams cut directly into the stone. The largest ever erected, now lying in fragments, would have stood over 30 meters tall. To cut such a thing from a single block of stone, to carve it, to transport it from the quarries some distance away, and then somehow to raise it upright against the highland sky. This was an act of engineering that speaks of a society with vast organizational capacity, with thousands of hands working in coordination, with rulers who had both the will and the resources to reach for something monumental. The kings of Aksum commissioned these stelae as grave markers, as declarations of power, as evidence of their place in a cosmic order they believed was watching. They were not modest men, these kings. Their inscriptions say as much long lists of conquests and tributaries, of nations subdued and gifts received, of God's thanks for victories. And yet they were also something more complicated than mere conquerors, as the chapters ahead will reveal in their own time. For now, it is enough to stand at the edge of the steely field as the afternoon light softens into gold, and to let the scale of what was here begin to settle. The wind moves. A raven calls from somewhere above the ruins. The stone is very old and very still, and in its stillness it holds more than any inscription could ever entirely say. The story of Aksum is long, and it moves through centuries of trade and war and conversion and slow, quiet transformation. It will take some time to tell it properly, but that is all right. There is no hurry here. In the time before Aksum became an empire, it was first a crossroads, not in the way that word is so often used as a place where roads merely intersect and travelers pass through without pausing. This crossroads had weight to it, a gravitational pull that drew people in and kept them. Merchants arrived with bolts of linen tied in Egyptian workshops and left months later, their wagons laden with ivory and obsidian. Craftsmen from the Arabian coast came seeking highland timber and stayed to teach their methods of stone cutting to local apprentices. Languages mingled in the market air the way wood smoke mingles with morning mist, slowly, inseparably, until it becomes impossible to say where one ends and the other begins. The people who would become Aksumite were themselves a mingling. In the centuries before the Common Era, populations from the southern Arabian Peninsula, from the kingdoms of Saba and Main, had crossed the narrow Strait of the Red Sea and settled among the existing highland communities of what is now Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. They brought with them a script, carved in elegant consonantal letters that would eventually evolve into Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. They brought agricultural techniques suited to terraced hillsides. They brought their gods Al-Makar, the moon deity of Saba, whose crescent symbol would appear on Aksumite coins and temples for centuries. But the meeting was not one of conqueror and conquered. The archaeological evidence suggests something more gradual, more mutual, a slow cultural conversation carried out across generations, in which neither the arriving Semitic-speaking settlers nor the existing Cushitic-speaking highland peoples simply absorbed the other. What emerged was something new, a third thing, belonging fully to neither origin, and yet carrying the marks of both. By the first century of the Common Era, this synthesis had produced a political structure capable of projecting authority across a wide territory. The kings of Aksum titled Negus, a word meaning king, and later Negusa-Nagast, King of Kings, claimed dominion not only over the Tigray highlands but over surrounding lowland peoples, over trade routes extending into the interior of Africa, and over communities along the Red Sea coast. Their authority was expressed in the familiar languages of power, tribute, taxation, the display of monumental architecture. Yet what made Aksumite kingship distinctive was the way it was legitimized. The king was not merely a military commander or wealthy patron. He was a sacred intermediary, a figure whose relationship with the divine gave the entire political order its coherence. Royal inscriptions and Aksum produced inscriptions in impressive quantities, carved in Ge'ez, in Sabaean, and in Greek. Sometimes all three on the same stone described kings as chosen by the great gods, as conquerors who acted with divine sanction, as builders of temples in gratitude for victories granted from above. One can imagine standing before such an inscription in the amber afternoon light, the stone warm from a long day of sun, the carved letters casting thin shadows that shift as the light moves. The words themselves are formal, measured. A king lists his campaigns, his subject peoples, the gifts he has offered to his gods. And yet, behind the formal language, there is something almost intimate, the sense of a man recording his place in a sacred order, asking to be remembered not merely as powerful but as righteous. The city of Aksum itself, at this period in its early flourishing, was still taking shape, a royal capital being assembled stone by stone, inscription by inscription. The steely fields at its heart were already accumulating their tall granite markers, each one a needle pointed at the sky, each one marking the presence of a royal tomb below the earth. Around them, construction was ongoing. Temples rose near the hill called Beta-Jorges. Reservoirs were cut into the rock to capture the seasonal rains and distribute water through the dry months. Workshops produced fine pottery, metal tools, and the remarkable Aksumite coins that began to appear in significant numbers perhaps around the late 2nd or early 3rd century, small discs of gold, silver, and bronze, stamped with the image of the reigning king wearing his crown and holding the double cross that would become so characteristic of Aksumite royal imagery. Those coins deserve a moment of quiet attention, because they are among the most personal records Aksum left behind. On each one, a face stylized, idealized, yet somehow particular. The king gazes from the surface of the metal with an expression of composed authority. On the earliest coins, a crescent and disc appear above his head, the old celestial symbols of the pre-Christian era. Later, as the kingdom changed its faith, those symbols would give way to the cross. But through all the changes of dynasty and religion, the face on the coin remained. The king, present in the hand of every merchant, every tax collector, every farmer who traded a measure of grain at the market in a dulis. For coins do more than facilitate commerce. They carry a message wherever they travel. And Aksumite coins have been found far from their homeland in Roman Egypt, in the ports of the Indian subcontinent, in the Arabian Peninsula. Each one was a small ambassador, whispering of a kingdom prosperous enough to mint its own gold, sophisticated enough to carry its ruler's portrait, confident enough to stamp its own name on objects circulating in the wider world. The name most often given in those early royal inscriptions is not a personal name but a title, GDR, rendered in Ge'ez script without vowels as was customary. Scholars have debated its pronunciation and its meaning, but what is clear is that the kings who bore it resided over a period of genuine consolidation, drawing together the various threads of highland culture, Red Sea commerce, and sacred authority into a fabric strong enough to last for centuries. Evenings in Aksum, one imagines, had a particular quality of stillness after the commerce of the day wound down. The highland air cooled quickly once the sun dropped behind the western ridges. Fires were lit in courtyards and cooking quarters. The smell of injera, the soft, sour flatbread that remains central to Ethiopian cooking to this day, drifted through the streets. Children whose names are lost to history ran between the great carved stones and disappeared into the blue dusk, and the city settled into its nighttime self, quieter and more intimate than the bustling port of a Julis far below. It was in this world layered, cosmopolitan, still in the process of becoming itself, that the conditions for Aksum's greatest centuries was slowly being assembled. The trade networks were in place. The royal ideology was taking form. The language was being written down and refined. And somewhere in the highland air, in the smoke of cooked fires and the echo of hammers on stone, the empire that would eventually reach across the Red Sea into Arabia was gathering itself. Patient and unhurried, like weather building on the horizon. The rains came late that year to the highlands above the Merib River, or so the records of the merchants suggest, in the gaps between their careful tallies of ivory and cloth. When the rains finally arrived, they arrived all at once, turning the red dust of the plateau into something closer to dark clay, and the stone channels that ran along the edges of the city of Aksum filled and chattered and overflowed into the terraced fields below, where the teff and the sorghum were waiting with the patient indifference of crops that have survived many late seasons and will survive many more. It was somewhere in the middle of the 3rd century, of the common era, that Aksum began to look outward with something more than a merchant's eye. The city had grown not explosively, not in the way that later empires would boast of expansion as though it were a sudden appetite, but gradually, the way a tree grows, by small increments that are invisible from one season to the next and astonishing when measured across a decade. More houses of stone now lined the approaches to the central precincts. More granaries held more grain. More strangers arrived at the market with accents that no one could quite place, from somewhere down the long coastal road that led, eventually, to the sea. That sea, the Red Sea, was the other kingdom Aksum inhabited, the invisible one, made not of stone and stelae, but of wind and salt and the rhythms of monsoon. Ships moved along it with the regularity of a slow breath, south and west, with the summer winds carrying Indian cotton and Roman glass and the small, intricate mechanisms of trade, north and east in the winter carrying ivory and obsidian and gold from the African interior. Goods that had traveled enormous distances by the time they reached the Aksumite port of Adulis and were loaded onto the next vessel in a chain that stretched, ultimately, to Alexandria, to Rome, to the workshops of southern Arabia and the spice-saturated harbors of western India. Adulis sat on a low shore, exposed and practical, without the dramatic cliff-tops of the highland capital. Those who lived there were a different kind of Aksumite, weathered differently. speaking more languages at once, eating food that reflected every direction the trade winds could blow. The Greek geographer whose account of this coastline has survived, written sometime around the 1st century, though copies were made and amended for generations afterward, described Adulis as a town of moderate size, its market supplied with goods from the interior and from across the water in roughly equal measure. He called it a place of legitimate trade, which suggests he had seen enough ports to know the other kind from Adulis. The road climbed. It climbed through a landscape of diminishing trees and increasing stone, through villages where women ground grain in the early mornings with a sound like slow conversation, through the smell of eucalyptus where it had begun to spread along the hillsides, through switchbacks where loaded camels moved with their characteristic expression of supreme tolerance. The journey from the coast to the highland city took many days, and those who made it regularly, the merchants, the royal messengers, the occasional foreign ambassador traveling with more ceremony than comfort, developed a particular familiarity with each stage of the ascent. Each shift in temperature and vegetation, each spring where the water tasted of the specific minerals of that particular hillside, dotted to the top of this long climb. Aksum received the world's goods and, in return, offered its own. The relationship was not quite equal, it never entirely is, but it was old enough and stable enough to have produced something that resembles mutual respect, or at least mutual dependence, which in the long record of human commerce amounts to much the same thing what Aksum sent into the world was, above all, ivory. The elephant populations of the African interior were still vast in the 3rd century, and Aksumite traders reached them through a network of intermediary peoples who carried the tusks northward along routes that were jealously guarded and only partially understood by those who waited at the receiving end. Alongside the ivory went tortoiseshell and rhinoceros horn, both of which commanded extraordinary prices in Mediterranean markets for reasons that combine genuine utility with the particular human appetite for materials that arrive from far away. There was also gold dust and small ingots from the rivers of the west, and there were enslaved people, a trade that the Aksumite kingdom participated in as matter-of-factly as every other major power of the ancient world, and which the surviving inscriptions record without ceremony or apology in the same terse accounting language used for cattle and grain. In exchange for all of this, the Roman world sent brass and copper, already worked into useful forms, basins, wire, the raw material for the Aksumite workshops that produced the kingdom's increasingly refined coinage. It sent cloth, both plain Egyptian linen and the more expensive dyed varieties whose colors carried their own prestige, and it sent olive oil in the distinctive ceramic jars whose broken fragments have been found in excavations of Adulis and of Aksum itself, a small terracotta testimony to how far common table oil can travel when the trade routes are open and the winds are reliable. The Roman world also sent, in small numbers and with considerable fanfare, diplomatic missions. These were not embassies in the modern sense. There was no permanent representation, no resident ambassador keeping careful notes, but periodic delegations, often coinciding with a change of emperor or some shift in the geopolitics of the Red Sea region that made Aksum's goodwill newly relevant. The Aksumite king received these missions with appropriate gravity, which is to say he received them in a way that made clear, without any need for explicit statement, that Aksum was not a client and not a curiosity, but a partner of comparable standing, whose resources and whose position at the hinge of African and Indian trade made it indispensable to the smooth functioning of a commerce that Rome depended on rather more than it cared to admit. The kings of Aksum in this period are known to us primarily through their coins and through the inscriptions they caused to be cut in stone, in the 3 languages that served simultaneously as the kingdom's official voices: Ge'ez for the people of the highlands, Sabaean for the southern Arabian connections that remained culturally alive, even as they became increasingly historical, and Greek for everyone else, for the merchants and the diplomats and the literate intermediaries who moved between worlds and needed a language capable of crossing all the boundaries at once. The coins themselves are small and hold a great deal of information in a very small space. On one face, the king's portrait, rendered with the stylized formality of an institution that understands that a face on a coin is not a likeness but a symbol. On the other, an image that shifted over time, a crescent and disk in the earlier period, the inheritance of those old Sabaean celestial loyalties. And then, beginning in the early 4th century, something new, something that would change the character of the kingdom entirely, a change so significant that it deserves its own unhurried telling in the chapters that follow this one. For now, in the middle decades of the 3rd century, The kingdom sits in the highland air and does what it has learned to do very well. It trades, it builds, it inscribes its name in 3 languages on the face of the world, and it waits, without quite knowing it is waiting, for the arrival of something that will give it a new vocabulary for everything it already believes. In the 4th century of the Common Era, there came to Aksum a young man from Tyre, a city of pale limestone and salt wind, perched on the Phoenician coast, who arrived not as a conqueror or an emissary, but as a shipwrecked stranger with nothing to his name except a quick mind and an uncertain faith. His name was Frumentius, and the sea had not been kind to him. He had been travelling with his uncle Meropius, a philosopher of modest reputation who wished to see the ports of the Red Sea for himself, to trace the routes that the old Greek geographers had sketched with such confident, imprecise hands. They had stopped at a harbour somewhere along the Aksumite coast. Accounts differ on precisely where, and perhaps the coastline itself has shifted slightly in the centuries since and there. In some obscure dispute between the ship's crew and men on the shore, nearly everyone aboard was killed. The details of the violence are not recorded with any particular clarity, which is perhaps fitting. History rarely preserves the chaos of small catastrophes, only their consequences. Frumentius survived. He was young enough, or useful enough, or simply lucky enough. He and a companion named Odysseus were taken inland, along the road that climbed from the coastal heat into the cooler air of the highlands, past the fields of teff standing pale and feathery in the afternoon light, past the caravans descending toward Adulis with their careful loads of ivory and aromatic wood. They arrived in Aksum as captives, though captivity in the Aksumite court was a thing of peculiar texture, not chains and dark rooms, but service, observation, gradual trust. The king of that time received them, and finding them educated men, set them to work. Odysseus became a cupbearer, a position of proximity and quiet intimacy with power. Frumentius, who had a gift for numbers and for the management of accounts, was given more complex responsibilities, working among the merchants and the records, learning the rhythms of a kingdom that was, in those years, very much alive with commerce and ambition. He learned geese. He learned the weight of the highland air in the rainy season, when the plateau turns a green so deep it seems almost invented. He learned the shape of the Aksumite court, its ceremonies, its hierarchies, the way that decisions moved through concentric rings of advisors and royal relatives before arriving, finally, at the word of the king. He was not unhappy by the accounts that survive. He was young, and the world he found himself in was strange enough to be interesting, and interesting enough to make strangers bearable. When that king died, his queen asked the 2 Tyrians to remain a while longer, to help guide the administration of the kingdom during the minority of her son. Frumentius, it seems, agreed without much hesitation. It was during these years of regency quiet years, by the standards of what came before, and after that Frumentius began to do something careful and patient. Among the Roman merchants who passed through Aksum, he sought out those who were Christians, and he gathered them together, and he gave them space and permission to practice their faith openly. He did not force anything. He did not preach in the markets or argue with the priests of the old religion. He simply created conditions in which a new thing could take root, the way a gardener prepares soil without yet knowing exactly what will grow. The old religion of Aksum was centered on a deity the inscriptions call Astor, a sky god of ancient Semitic lineage, connected to the evening star, to rain and celestial order. There were also other presences in the Aksumite spiritual world, local powers, ancestral spirits, the particular sacred quality attributed to certain mountains and certain trees. The temples and altars of Aksum were not empty places. They were attended, maintained, woven into the everyday life of the kingdom in ways that no young stranger from Tyre could simply displace by wishing it so. And yet something was shifting, in that slow, nearly imperceptible way that fundamental changes always shift before they become visible. When the young king Ezana reached his majority and took the throne fully into his own hands, Frumentius asked permission to return to the Roman world. The request was granted. Odysseus went back to Tyre, where he eventually told his story to a historian named Rufinus, which is how we have any of this at all refracted through memory and translation, and the particular interests of a late Roman ecclesiastical writer who wanted, above all, to tell a story of providence working through unlikely instruments. Frumentius travelled to Alexandria, to the great patriarchate there, and presented himself before Athanasius, one of the most consequential bishops of the 4th century, a man who spent much of his life in exile and controversy over the nature of Christ, who wrote in a dense and combative Greek and who understood the political weight of theological questions, the way a general understands the weight of terrain, or Athanasius. Frumentius described what he had seen in Aksum, the opening, the possibility, the particular readiness of a kingdom that stood at the crossroads of so many worlds. He asked, essentially, that a bishop be sent to the Aksumites. Athanasius looked at the man before him and concluded that no better candidate existed. He consecrated Frumentius himself on the spot as the first bishop of Aksum, the one who would later be known in Ethiopian tradition as Abba Salama, the father of peace, and as Kisate Byron, the revealer of light. Frumentius sailed back south. Along the coast, he had once travelled as a shipwrecked young man with nothing, and returned to the court of Ezana, whom he had known since the king was a child learning to hold the weight of a crown. What happened next unfolded over years, not months. Christianity did not arrive in Aksum the way a storm arrives sudden, irresistible, transforming everything at once. It arrived more the way a new dye enters a weaving, slowly, thread by thread, until one day the pattern has changed and it is difficult to say precisely when the change began. Ezana's early inscriptions invoke the old gods. His later inscriptions do not. In their place appears a different formulation, the Lord of Heaven, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, rendered in the same careful guise and Greek that his predecessors had used to claim dominion over conquered territories and foreign kings. The language of faith and the language of power occupied the same stone surfaces, the same carefully incised lines. The coins changed too. The crescent and disk of the old celestial religion gave way to the cross, a symbol that would remain on Aksumite coinage for centuries, long after the dynasty itself had faded from the world's attention. And somewhere in the highlands, in a city of obelisks and trade goods and the smell of incense carried on a highland wind, a kingdom had become something new, the first state in sub-Saharan Africa to adopt Christianity as its official religion. Earlier than the kingdoms of Europe that would later imagine themselves the faith's natural home, the shipwrecked boy from Tyre had, it seemed, found his purpose at the end of a very long road. In the years after Ezana's conversion, the stonecutters of Aksum found themselves carving a new symbol into surfaces that had never known it before. The cross appeared not only on coins, pressed into gold and bronze with the same careful hands that had once pressed crescent and disk, but on stelae, on doorposts, on the faces of buildings that caught the morning light along the main avenues of the city. It was a gradual thing, the way a new season arrives, not announced, not sudden, but present one morning in the temperature of the air and the angle of light through an open window. The city itself had not changed in its bones. The great stelae still stood as they had always stood, those tall needles of granite that the Aksumites raised over the tombs of their kings, tapering toward the sky with carved false windows and false doors along their faces, as if the stone were imitating a building, as if the dead within deserved a house with many stories. The tallest of these had fallen, or so it is believed, long before Ezana's time, brought down by its own ambition and the limitations of the earth beneath it. But others remained, and they cast their long shadows westward each morning over the terraced ground of the royal burial complex, over the grass that grew between the cut stones, over the small offerings that people still left there, old habits being slower to disappear than old inscriptions. The priests of the older ways were not erased overnight. Religions do not vanish like smoke. They thin, they change shape, they fold themselves into corners of daily life, into the names people call their children, into the particular way a farmer reads the sky before a planting. The god Asda, associated with the evening star, the god Marum, the fierce one whom kings had long called their divine ancestor. These names grew quieter in public speech, but they lingered in memory the way old words linger in a language that has borrowed heavily from another tongue. What Ezana's court had built, in those decades following the conversion, was a new texture layered over the old structure. The feast days shifted, the prayers changed their direction, and the merchants who came to Aksum from Alexandria and from the cities of the Roman East felt, upon arriving, a certain familiar breath in the air, not identical to what they knew at home, but recognizable, the way a song sounds recognizable even when sung in an unfamiliar voice, among those merchants, and among the pilgrims and travelers who came after them. There were always those who looked at Aksum and tried to measure it against what they knew. They counted the streets and calculated the distances. They noted the height of the stelae with something between admiration and unease. They watched the market at Adulis, the great port on the Red Sea coast, and tried to understand the quantity of goods that moved through Aksumite hands, Adulis itself was a city of considerable character. It sat close enough to the sea to smell it, and the salt air mixed there with the smell of frankincense brought down from the highland plateau, and with the sharper smell of animal hides bundled for transport, and with the sweeter smell of beeswax stored in large clay jars in the cooler recesses of the warehouses. The harbour could hold many ships at once, and at the height of the trading season, those months when the monsoon winds made the crossing from Arabia and from India favourable, the anchorage would be full. Ships lay at their moorings like sleeping birds with folded wings, waiting for the wind to turn. The goods that moved through Adulis in the 4th and 5th centuries were various enough to suggest a world very much in contact with itself. Ivory came down from the deep interior, from elephants hunted far to the south and west of the Aksumite heartland, carried by long caravans through the highland passes. Gold dust and gold nuggets arrived from the same directions, measured carefully in the market by traders who kept small balances with the ease of long practice. Tortoiseshell came in from coastal hunters, and obsidian from volcanic regions to the north, and cotton cloth woven on the plateau, and slaves who had been captured in raids along the expanding Aksumite frontier. This too was part of the trade, as it was part of almost every ancient economy, and it moved through the same markets as the frankincense and the iron and the finished glass that came in return from the workshops of Alexandria and Antioch. In exchange for these things, Aksum received wine in sealed amphorae that had travelled far, wine from the eastern Mediterranean, from vineyards the merchants themselves might never have seen, consumed at tables in the highland city by people who had never left the Horn of Africa. There came copper and tin and sheets of iron. There came fine linen cloth and books, and objects made of glass so thin they seemed barely solid, small vessels for perfume or medicine, coloured in blue and green, catching light in ways that local craftsmen studied carefully and slowly began to imitate. The artisans of Aksum were skilled, and they were interested in the workshops of the city. Potters worked their wheels and produced vessels with stamped geometric ornament. Metalworkers hammered and alloyed and cast. The royal mint, that small, careful operation that had been producing coinage since at least the 3rd century, continued its work, and the coins it made were among the finest produced anywhere in their era. Small they were and thin, but the engraving on them was precise. The kings had their portraits rendered on the obverse, wearing elaborate crowns and holding what appeared to be stalks of grain or ritual objects, their names inscribed around the edge in Greek on one side and in the Ge'ez script of Aksum's own language on the other, a bilingualism built into the metal itself. The city speaking to 2 audiences simultaneously, as it had always done. Ge'ez was a language that carried itself with a kind of quiet weight, related to the languages of southern Arabia. It had developed on the African side of the Red Sea into something distinctly its own, with an alphabet of considerable elegance, each consonant character modified by small additions that indicated the accompanying vowel, making it one of the earliest fully voweled scripts in the region. It was the language of inscriptions and of administration and of the court, and it was the language into which, in the 5th century, the Bible would be translated by a group of scholars whose names have been preserved in Ethiopian memory with a particular kind of reverence. Those translators came from the Eastern Mediterranean world, driven partly by theological controversy, partly by the wandering instinct that seems to have characterized so many learned men of that era. They brought with them scrolls and their knowledge of Greek and Syriac, and they sat with the language of Ge'ez and worked it carefully, finding its capacity for nuance, testing its rhythms against the rhythms of sacred text. What they produced was a translation that became foundational, not merely a version of the Bible, but the Bible as Aksum knew it. The Bible as Ethiopia would carry it forward through centuries that neither the translators nor their patrons could have imagined. But that work lay still a little ahead, in the years just beyond where this chapter rests. For now, the city was settling into its new religious identity as the afternoon settles into its shadows gradually, without announcement, the angles of light changing so slowly that one notices only in retrospect how much the room has darkened, how quietly the evening has begun to arrive. In the 5th century of the Common Era, a group of men arrived in Aksum carrying little more than 1 sandals, a knowledge of scripture, and a determination so quiet it resembled patience. They came from different places, from Antioch, from Tyre, from Constantinople, from the monasteries of Egypt and Syria, and history would eventually call them the 9 Saints, though that name came later, after their work had already taken root in the rich soil of the highlands. At the time of their arrival, they were simply scholars and monks, men who had learned to live on very little and to read in several languages, and who believed, with the unhurried certainty of the deeply devoted, that the words of Scripture ought to exist in the tongue of every people. Aksum already had its Christian king, already had its cathedral, already had priests who performed the liturgy and bishops who corresponded with Alexandria. But the faith, in those early decades, still wore its Greek and Coptic clothing. The prayers were spoken in languages most ordinary people could not follow, and the sacred texts remained inaccessible to anyone who had not spent years in a city school learning letters that were not their own. The 9 saints understood this, and they set about changing it. They spread across the highlands with a deliberateness that resembled the movement of water through stone slope, persistent, shaping the landscape without announcing itself. One settled near Adwa, in the northern hills where the mornings were cold and the juniper trees held mist in their branches until midday. Another went further east, toward the edge of the plateau where the land began its long descent toward the hot lowlands. A third established himself in a valley where farmers grew wheat in the thin, careful soil between basalt outcroppings, and where the nearest village was a half-day's walk along a track once smoothed by generations of sandaled feet, each of them built, in time, a small community, a church of mud and timber at first, then something more permanent in stone, with a courtyard where students gathered in the mornings and where the smell of frankincense drifted out through narrow windows into the highland air, and at the center of everything they did was the work of translation. It was not a simple task, this rendering of Greek and Coptic scripture into Ge'ez. The two worlds of language did not map neatly onto each other, and there were concepts in the Greek text, theological abstractions, Hellenistic turns of phrase, words that had accumulated centuries of philosophical weight that required long deliberation before an equivalent could be found, or constructed, or coaxed into being from the existing resources of the Ge'ez tongue. The monks worked slowly, by lamplight in the evenings when the day's teaching was done, reading aloud to each other and listening carefully to the sound of each rendered phrase, the way a weaver listens to the tension in a thread before committing it to the loom. They consulted with local priests and with elders who knew the old stories, who could tell them which words carried gravity in ordinary speech and which ones had one thing with overuse. What emerged, over decades of this careful labor, was a Bible unlike any other, not simply a translation, but a document that had absorbed something of the land and the people through whose minds it had passed. The cadences of Ge'ez scripture were not quite those of its Greek source, and that difference was not an error but a kind of flowering. The same text finding its own form in a new climate, the monasteries that grew around the 9 saints became something more than religious houses. They became, over the following generations, the great centers of Aksumite learning places where manuscripts were copied and preserved, where young men came to study not only theology but grammar, mathematics, and the interpretation of natural phenomena. The highlands of Aksum, already rich with the terraced fields and carved stone towers of an ancient civilization, acquired this new layer, the quiet hum of scholarship, the smell of ink and vellum, the sound of boys repeating conjugations under the shade of a sycamore fig. One of the most enduring of these communities grew up at a place called Debre Damo, set upon a flat-topped mountain in the Tigray highlands and Amber, as such formations are called in the region. A table of rock rising sheer from the surrounding landscape with no path to the top except a rope of twisted leather lowered from above. The monastery that took root there became both refuge and archive, its isolation a kind of protection, the cliff face serving the same purpose that locked doors served in the cities of the lowlands. Manuscripts carried up that rope by hand, wrapped in cloth to protect them from the weather of the ascent, survived there in the dry highland air for centuries beyond anything that would have been possible in a more accessible place. The 9 saints did not only bring scripture, they brought with them a monastic tradition that had been developing in Egypt and Syria for more than a century, a tradition of structured community life, of daily liturgical rhythm, of fasting and prayer as physical disciplines that shape the body as much as the mind. This tradition found a ready home in the highlands of Aksum, where the landscape itself seemed to encourage a certain contemplative disposition, the enormous sky, the silence of the high plateaus, the way distance arranged itself in layers of blue and grey toward every horizon. Ordinary farming families who had, a generation before, maintained household altars to the old deities alongside newly acquired Christian symbols began, through proximity to these monasteries, to understand their faith in a different way, not as something practiced in the cathedral of the capital on feast days, but as a texture woven through the whole of daily life, a rhythm of prayer and fasting and commemoration that followed the agricultural calendar closely enough that the two became almost indistinguishable. The year had its seasons, and the church had its seasons, and the two moved together like the rains and the planting, each one calling the other into being. In this way, through the patient work of translation and the slow accumulation of monastic community life, something was being built in the highlands of Aksum that would outlast the kingdom itself, a form of Christian practice so thoroughly rooted in the language and landscape of the place that no later disruption would be able to entirely uproot it. But in the cities and ports, beyond the shadow of the monastery walls, the world was shifting in ways that had nothing to do with theology, and the changes gathering on the horizon would, in time, demand the attention of even the most contemplative minds in those high, quiet places. The rains, when they came to the highland plateau, arrived not as a sudden storm, but as a slow darkening of the horizon, a bruising of the sky that began in the far southwest and spread across the vault of heaven with the patience of something very old and very certain of itself. The farmers of the Aksumite highlands had names for each phase of this arrival. The first tentative drops that raised small craters in the dust, the deepening green that spread across the terraced fields like a stain of emerald ink, the weeks of persistent grey cloud that settled into the valleys like wool pressed between the ridges. For generation after generation, the agricultural calendar had turned on this rhythm, and the empire's wealth, its grain, its cattle, its capacity to feed the great city, and its monuments rested on nothing more and nothing less than this annual covenant between cloud and earth. In the 6th century of the Common Era, that covenant began to feel uncertain. The change was not dramatic. It announced itself in the language of small, easily dismissed things. A spring that ran thinner than the elders remembered. A harvest that filled the granaries to 3/4 rather than 4. A year when the rains came late, and a murmuring ran through the highland villages that was not quite fear but was its quieter cousin. The stonecutters and the scribes and the merchants of the great city continued their work, and the carved thrones still received the names of kings, and the smoke from the incense burners still rose in the cool mornings above the rooftops of Aksum. But in the countryside beyond the city's shadow, something was shifting slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way a great stone shifts on a hillside long before it falls. There was a king in this era whose name the stelae record as Caleb, sometimes rendered as Ella at Speha in his throne name, and he ruled during a period when the empire still commanded enormous respect across the Red Sea world. His court received ambassadors. His name was known in Constantinople and in the courts of Arabia. And it was under Caleb that Aksum made its most dramatic outward gesture, a military expedition across the narrow sea to the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, into the region the ancients called Himyar. The reasons for this campaign were layered, as reasons for such things always are. There was religion. A Jewish king in Himyar had overseen the persecution of Christian communities in his territory, and Caleb, as a Christian monarch in alliance with the Byzantine emperor, framed his crossing of the sea in the language of holy obligation. There was also the older language of trade, the routes that carried incense and silk and ivory through the port of Qana, and northward toward the Mediterranean world passed through Himyar, and Aksum had long held interests there that were both commercial and political. The two languages, sacred and mercantile, wound around each other so thoroughly that it would be impossible, and perhaps beside the point, to separate them. The crossing itself was a feat of considerable scale. Ships were assembled or commandeered, and soldiers drawn from the highlands, and from subject peoples, and perhaps from allied groups along the coast, were loaded onto vessels and carried across the water that the Aksumites called the Sea of Erythrea. The journey was short in distance, but long in consequence. Caleb's forces landed, and after a campaign whose details are recorded in fragments across several languages and traditions, the Himyarite kingdom fell under Aksumite control. An Aksumite viceroy was installed. For a generation, the empire held territory on both sides of the Red Sea. It is a remarkable thing to pause and consider. An African empire projecting military power into the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century, maintaining governance across open water, shaping the political geography of a region whose subsequent history would be utterly transformed by the emergence of Islam within 100 years. The Aksumite occupation of Himyar is a seam in history where enormous forces were pressing against each other: Byzantine ambition, Sassanid-Persian rivalry, the internal dynamics of Arabian tribal politics, and Aksum sat at the center of that seam for a brief, consequential moment. the viceroy Caleb installed was a man named Abraha. And Abraha is one of those figures who steps out of the background of history and becomes a story of his own. He governed with considerable independence, eventually refusing to return revenues to Caleb's court and, by some accounts, declining to return at all. Whether this represented simple ambition or a more complex negotiation with the realities of governing a distant territory is difficult to know. What the Arabic sources record and what later Islamic tradition would preserve in vivid detail is that Abraha undertook the construction of a great cathedral at Ezana, a building described with such extravagance of marble and mosaic and gilded ceiling that it was intended, some accounts suggest, to redirect the pilgrimage route of Arabia away from older sacred sites and toward this new Christian monument. Whether this ambition was real or elaborated by later storytellers, the cathedral existed, and it stood as evidence of the reach of Aksumite cultural power into a world that was already beginning its long turn toward a different future. Caleb himself, by the later accounts that Ethiopian tradition preserves, eventually abdicated. He sent his crown to Jerusalem to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, according to the most common version of this story, and withdrew to a monastery, ending his days not as a king on a carved throne, but as a monk in the highland quiet. Whether this is precisely what happened, or whether it is the kind of ending that later memory gives to kings who deserve it, the image carries its own truth. A man who had commanded fleets and directed campaigns across a sea, sitting finally in a small stone cell, listening to the sound of wind in the thorn trees. His crown carried away across the world's distances to rest in a city he had never seen. The expedition to Himyar was the last great outward expansion of the Aksumite Empire. It had demonstrated conclusively that the kingdom of the highlands was capable of projecting force and governance far beyond its borders, that it was, by any measure that the ancient world used, an empire of the first rank. But empires, like the highland reigns, have their seasons, and the long contraction that followed would be shaped by forces both within and far beyond the plateau where the great stelae still stood in their rows, casting their long shadows westward across the dust in the late afternoon light. The next chapter in that story would belong not to soldiers or kings, but to the slow, reshaping pressure of the world that was rising. Just then, on the far side of the Red Sea, in the years that followed Caleb's long and luminous reign, something in the rhythm of Aksum began to change, not all at once, not with any single declaration or disaster, but the way a fire changes when the largest log has finally burned through, settling into quieter, smaller flames that still give warmth, still give light, yet no longer throw their brightness into the far corners of the room. The Arabian venture had cost much, not only in ships and soldiers, in the year spent feeding and supplying a garrison across an open sea, but in something harder to measure, the particular kind of confidence that comes from believing the world will always expand to meet your ambitions. Aksum had reached its furthest shore. It had planted its symbol, a carved throne stela of power on foreign soil, and now that soil was slipping back quietly, like sand pulled by a tide. Abraha ruled Himyar until his own death, and his sons after him, and in all that time, the connection to Aksum grew thinner, more ceremonial, less real. Letters still passed between the courts, perhaps. Traders still remembered the shared tongue of commerce and the shared god of the church. But the armies did not return, and without armies, the language of empire eventually falls silent. Back on the high plateau, the court at Aksum continued its ancient ceremonies. Incense rose in columns of pale smoke through the doorways of St. Mary of Zion. Priests moved through the liturgy in Ge'ez, that language which had grown up with the kingdom itself, now carrying within its syllables the full weight of centuries of inscriptions cut into granite, of merchant contracts sealed with wax, of hymns composed by scholars who had read both the Psalms and the old Sabaean poetry and woven them together into something entirely new. The city itself was still impressive. A traveller arriving in this period, some merchant from the Persian Gulf ports, perhaps, or a monk making a slow pilgrimage from Alexandria, would have looked out from the surrounding hills and seen a place of genuine grandeur. The great stelae stood as they always had, their shadows moving across the ground through the long afternoon, marking time in a way that needed no sundial. The royal tombs lay beneath the earth, silent and sealed. The market quarter hummed with its familiar transactions, bolts of cotton from the Nile Valley, tortoiseshell and obsidian from the coast, iron goods from the highland workshops, small clay lamps that burned the same oil they had burned for 500 years. The population of the city was a layered thing, accumulated across generations. There were the old Aksumite families, the ones who had been here since before the stelae were raised, who traced their ancestry in careful oral lines back to the first kings. There were the merchants' families Sabaean descended, Greek-influenced, some with relatives still living in Alexandria or Aulis who kept their own quarter of the city and their own internal customs, even as they adopted the Christian faith and spoke these in public life. There were craftspeople, stonecutters who still knew the old techniques, though there were fewer commissions for great monuments now. Weavers who produced the fine cotton and linen garments that Aksumite aristocrats wore in layered folds. Potters whose workshops produced both everyday storage jars and the finer painted vessels that ended up in church treasuries. And there were the clergy. By this period, the church had become the single most elaborate institution in Aksumite life, richer, in some ways, than the royal court itself in terms of daily ceremony and organizational complexity. The 9 saints, those Syrian monks who had arrived generations earlier and spread out across the highlands founding their monasteries, had left behind them a network of communities that now trained their own novices, copied their own manuscripts, maintained their own agricultural estates, and quietly shaped the way ordinary people understood their place in the world and their obligations to those above and below them. A monastery in this period was a particular kind of place. Its walls were not always of stone. Many of the highland foundations were built in the traditional Ethiopian style, with timber frames and packed earth and thatched roofing that needed constant repair against the heavy summer rains. But within those walls, there existed a regularity of life that the outside world rarely achieved. The bells, or in some communities, the resonant wooden boards struck with mallets, called dembles, whose sound carried farther than one might expect across the thin highland air, marked the hours of prayer. The monks rose before dawn, assembled in the dim church where beeswax candles burned in iron holders, and sang the morning office in voices that had been trained since childhood to sustain long melodic lines without strain. The liturgical chant of Aksum had its own distinctive character. It was not the same as the Greek chant of Constantinople, nor the Coptic chant of Alexandria, though it shared ancestry with both. Over the generations, in the particular acoustics of Ethiopian highland churches, with their thick walls and low ceilings and the smell of incense that had accumulated in the wood and stone over decades, the music had developed its own inflections, its own ornamental patterns, its own understanding of how a long sustained note could carry meaning that words alone could not. It was said that the great teacher Whiteard had composed the foundational hymns of the Ethiopian church sometime in this same century. Some placed him in the reign of Caleb himself, others later. The stories told of Whiteard were not so different from the stories told of inspired artists in every tradition. The slow failure, the moment of sudden illumination, the gift that arrived not through effort, but through surrender. A dripping branch, a persistent caterpillar, a small creature's patient climbing the image differed in the telling. What remained constant was the sense that the music had come from somewhere outside ordinary human invention, that it had been received rather than made, and that this was precisely why it endured. Whether or not the legend was true in its particulars, the music was real. It filled the churches. It shaped the hours. And in a time when the political world was beginning its long, slow contraction, when the Red Sea trade was gradually shifting, when new powers were stirring in the Arabian interior, when the roads of empire were growing quieter, the music continued unchanged, indifferent to the rise and fall of courts, patient in the way that all truly deep things are patient. The rains came each summer as they always had. The highland fields turned green, the rivers ran brown and fast, and in the cool mornings that followed the heaviest downpours, when the air smelled of wet earth and the distant mountains disappeared entirely into low cloud, the priests of Aksum continued to walk the same paths between the same buildings that their predecessors had walked, carrying the same vessels, reciting the same words, in the oldest and perhaps the most durable form of continuity that a civilization can possess. In the years that followed Caleb's long and luminous reign, something in the rhythm of Aksum began to change, not all at once, not with any single declaration or disaster, but the way a fire changes when the largest log has finally burned through, settling into quieter, smaller flames that still give warmth, still give light, yet no longer throw their brightness into the far corners of the room. The Arabian venture had cost much, not only in ships and soldiers, in the year spent feeding and supplying a garrison across an open sea, but in something harder to measure, the particular kind of confidence that comes from believing the world will always expand to meet your ambitions. Aksum had reached its furthest shore. It had planted its symbol, the carved throne stela of power on foreign soil. And now that soil was slipping back quietly, like sand pulled by a tide. Abreha ruled Himyar until his own death, and his sons after him, and in all that time, the connection to Aksum grew thinner, more ceremonial, less real. Letters still passed between the courts, perhaps. Traders still remembered the shared tongue of commerce and the shared god of the church. But the armies did not return, and without armies, the language of empire eventually falls silent back on the high plateau. The court at Aksum continued its ancient ceremonies. Incense rose in columns of pale smoke through the doorways of St. Mary of Zion. Priests moved through the liturgy in Ge'ez, that language which had grown up with the kingdom itself, now carrying within its syllables the full weight of centuries of inscriptions cut into granite, of merchant contracts sealed with wax, of hymns composed by scholars who had read both the Psalms and the old Sabaean poetry and woven them together into something entirely new. The city itself was still impressive. A traveller arriving in this period, some merchant from the Persian Gulf ports, perhaps, or a monk making a slow pilgrimage from Alexandria would have looked out from the surrounding hills and seen a place of genuine grandeur. The great stelae stood as they always had, their shadows moving across the ground through the long afternoon, marking time in a way that needed no sundial. The royal tombs lay beneath the earth, silent and sealed. The market quarter hummed with its familiar transactions, bolts of cotton from the Nile Valley, tortoiseshell and obsidian from the coast, iron goods from the highland workshops, small clay lamps that burned the same oil they had burned for 500 years. The population of the city was a layered thing, accumulated across generations. There were the old Aksumite families, the ones who had been here since before the stelae were raised, who traced their ancestry in careful oral lines back to the first kings. There were the merchants' families Sabaean descended, Greek influenced, some with relatives still living in Alexandria or Dulis who kept their own quarter of the city and their own internal customs, even as they adopted the Christian faith and spoke Ge'ez in public life. There were craftspeople, stonecutters who still knew the old techniques, though there were fewer commissions for great monuments now. Weavers who produced the fine cotton and linen garments that Aksumite aristocrats wore in layered folds. Potters whose workshops produced both everyday storage jars and the finer painted vessels that ended up in church treasuries. And there were the clergy. By this period, the church had become the single most elaborate institution in Aksumite life, richer, in some ways, than the royal court itself in terms of daily ceremony and organizational complexity. The 9 saints, those Syrian monks who had arrived generations earlier and spread out across the highlands founding their monasteries, had left behind them a network of communities that now trained their own novices, copied their own manuscripts, maintained their own agricultural estates, and quietly shaped the way ordinary people understood their place in the world and their obligations to those above and below them. A monastery in this period was a particular kind of place. Its walls were not always of stone. Many of the highland foundations were built in the traditional Ethiopian style, with timber frames and packed earth and thatched roofing that needed constant repair against the heavy summer rains. But within those walls, there existed a regularity of life that the outside world rarely achieved. The bells, or in some communities, the resonant wooden boards struck with mallets, called dembles, whose sound carried farther than one might expect across the thin highland air, marked the hours of prayer. The monks rose before dawn, assembled in the dim church where beeswax candles burned in iron holders, and sang the morning office in voices that had been trained since childhood to sustain long melodic lines without strain. The liturgical chant of Aksum had its own distinctive character. It was not the same as the Greek chant of Constantinople, nor the Coptic chant of Alexandria, though it shared ancestry with both. Over the generations, in the particular acoustics of Ethiopian highland churches, with their thick walls and low ceilings and the smell of incense that had accumulated in the wood and stone over decades, the music had developed its own inflections, its own ornamental patterns, its own understanding of how a long sustained note could carry meaning that words alone could not. It was said that the great teacher Whiteard had composed the foundation hymns of the Ethiopian church sometime in this same century. Some placed him in the reign of Caleb himself, others later. The stories told of Whiteard were not so different from the stories told of inspired artists in every tradition. The slow failure, the moment of sudden illumination, the gift that arrived not through effort, but through surrender. A dripping branch, a persistent caterpillar, a small creature's patient climbing the image differed in the telling. What remained constant was the sense that the music had come from somewhere outside ordinary human invention, that it had been received rather than made, and that this was precisely why it endured, whether or not the legend was true in its particulars. The music was real. It filled the churches. It shaped the hours. And in a time when the political world was beginning its long, slow contraction, when the Red Sea trade was gradually shifting, when new powers were stirring in the Arabian interior, when the roads of empire were growing quieter, the music continued unchanged, indifferent to the rise and fall of courts, patient in the way that all truly deep things are patient. The rains came each summer as they always had. The highland fields turned green. The rivers ran brown and fast. And in the cool mornings that followed the heaviest downpours, when the air smelled of wet earth and the distant mountains disappeared entirely into low cloud, the priests of Aksum continued to walk the same paths between the same buildings that their predecessors had walked, carrying the same vessels, reciting the same words, in the oldest and perhaps the most durable form of continuity that a civilization can possess. In the 7th decade after Caleb had laid down his crown, the sea routes that had once carried Aksumite merchants toward Arabia and the distant ports of India began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to change their character. It was not that the ships stopped sailing. They still set out from the harbour town of Adulis, their hulls heavy with ivory and obsidian, with fragrant resins and the dark, dense hides of highland cattle. But the faces on the docks were different now. The Persian merchants, representatives of the Sassanid Empire, whose power had been gathering in the east like a slow accumulation of storm, appeared with greater frequency at the wooden quays, their robes the colour of deep saffron, their translators speaking accented Ge'ez with the particular carefulness of men who know they are outsiders negotiating in someone else's language. The shift was gradual. The way the colour leaves a piece of dyed cloth left too long in the sun, not a sudden bleaching, but a slow return to the underlying thread. Aksum had held the straits of the Red Sea in its influence for generations, had understood that whoever moved goods between the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean held a kind of invisible authority over the flow of the known world's wealth. That understanding had not changed, but the world itself had changed around it. In the ports of southern Arabia, in the harbours that had once answered to Aksumite governors or to kings who knew which power to placate, a new commercial logic was settling in. The Sassanid Persians had extended their reach through the Gulf and around the peninsula's southern edge, and their traders moved with the confidence of men backed by an empire that was, at that particular moment in history, ascendant. Adulis still functioned. The merchants of Aksum still knew how to bargain, how to pack a hold, how to read the seasonal winds. But the margins had narrowed, and the routes had multiplied in ways that did not always pass through the highlands within Aksum itself. This was felt not as a catastrophe, but as a kind of atmospheric pressure, a heaviness that settled in the counting houses and the marketplace conversations, in the slightly longer silences between merchants discussing the price of frankincense. The great city continued its rhythms. The churches received their offerings at dawn. The stelae stood in their rows against the core highland sky, unchanged and unchanging. But there were fewer new commissions for monumental stone, fewer caravans arriving with exotic goods from across the water, and the traders who came from distant places were, more often than not, traveling through rather than staying to build the long relationships that commerce at its most intimate requires. Along the coast, Adulis, that ancient port whose written record stretched back to Greek travelers who had marveled at its warehouses, and its sheltered anchorage, continued to receive ships, but its population was becoming more mixed, more transient. Where Aksumite officials had once maintained a clear administrative presence, now there was a looser arrangement, a kind of negotiated coexistence between the Highland Kingdom's representatives and the practical realities of a port that served whoever arrived with cargo. Some of the old merchant families of Aksum had sons who spent years in Adulis learning the rhythms of the sea trade, who came back to the Highland capital with sun-darkened skin and a slightly foreign cadence in their Ge'ez, carrying with them little packets of knowledge about what the world beyond the water wanted, what it was willing to pay, and what it could no longer easily obtain. These young men were useful. They sat at the edges of the great trading councils and translated not just languages but entire worldviews, the particular geometry of how far away empires understood value and scarcity. It was through such intermediaries that Aksum continued to gather intelligence about the broader world, even as its direct control over that world's corridors diminished. The kingdom was not retreating into ignorance. It was adapting slowly, with the deliberate patience of an institution that had outlasted many crises and understood, at some institutional level, that continuity itself was a form of strength. Far to the north and west, the great Christian empire of Byzantium was entering one of its own turbulent passages, the long, grinding conflict with Sassanid Persia that would exhaust both powers over the following generations and leave the entire eastern Mediterranean landscape transformed. Aksum had always maintained a careful relationship with Constantinople, exchanging ambassadors, receiving theological correspondence, occupying a respected if distant position in the mental geography of Byzantine ecclesiastical culture. That relationship continued, carried forward through letters written on parchment in formal Ge'ez and formal Greek, through gifts of rare animals and exotic materials that crossed enormous distances, to land in the courts of emperors who received them with ceremonial gravity, but the practical weight of that relationship had lightened. Byzantium, consumed by its own survival, had less bandwidth to project influence southward. The theological correspondence continued, the formal courtesies were maintained, but the sense of active partnership that had characterized the Caleb years when Aksumite military force had operated in direct alignment with Byzantine strategic interest belonged now to living memory rather than to current reality. There was, in all of this, something that the chroniclers of later centuries would struggle to name precisely. It was not decline in the simple sense, not a collapse, not a conquest, not a sudden rupture. It was more like a long exhalation. The kingdom of Aksum had breathed in for centuries, drawing the world's commerce and the world's religions and the world's political complexities into its highland lungs, and now it was breathing out slowly, with a kind of dignified release, as if it understood that no single power holds the center of the world's attention forever, and that there was something almost restful in stepping, incrementally, toward the margins. The ivory still came down from the interior, carried by the same roots that had functioned for centuries, along the same dusty paths where the same species of tree provided shade at the same intervals. The frankincense trees on the Eritrean plateau still bled their pale, aromatic resin each season, and the gatherers still made the same careful cuts with the same iron tools, and the resin still hardened in the highland air and was sorted and packed and carried to the coast on the backs of the same patient animals. Life, in other words, continued with the particular stubbornness that life always displays in the face of geopolitical shifts that seem enormous from above but are, at ground level, mostly invisible. A farmer in the highlands north of Aksum, tending his terraced fields through the long green season of the rains, would not have felt that his world had changed profoundly. His church still held its dawn service. The priest still intoned the old liturgical phrases in Ge'ez. The rains came and went as they always had, and the grain grew and was harvested and ground into the flour that made the bread that was broken at the tables of people whose lives were fundamentally continuous with the lives of their grandparents and their grandparents before them. It is in this way that empires carry themselves forward even when the formal structures of their power have begun their long reconfiguration through the millions of small habitual acts that require no decree, no military presence, no commercial treaty. The kingdom of Aksum was becoming something slightly different from what it had been, but it had not yet become something unrecognizable. And in the quieter corners of the highland world, the distinction between the two was not yet legible. The sea would carry many more changes in the years ahead, and the world beyond the Red Sea was preparing one of its most dramatic transformations. But for now, in the decades just past the memory of Caleb, Aksum moved through its days with the unhurried dignity of an old institution that has not yet been told by history, by circumstance, or by itself, that it is old. In the highlands above Adulis, where the road narrowed to little more than a goat path threading between stands of wild olive and juniper, there lived a stonecutter named Jonas who had spent 40 years shaping the granite faces of commemorative stelae. He was not a famous man. His name appeared in no inscription. The kings and priests and merchants whose monuments he carved outlasted him in every written record. And yet, his hands had shaped more of Aksum's visible memory than almost any scribe or chronicler of his age. He worked in a small yard behind his house, beneath a rough canopy of woven grass that kept the worst of the midday sun from his shoulders, and the sound of his mallet against the chisel was as regular and unhurried as the striking of a water clock. Stone dust had settled permanently into the creases of his knuckles. His wife said it had turned his hands the color of old cloud. Jonas had learned the trade from his uncle, who had learned it from a man who claimed to have worked on the great stelae raised in the time of Ezana, the towering obelisks that still stood at the heart of the city. their surfaces carved with false doors and false windows, their tips once crowned with iron crescents, now once smoothed by generations of rain. Whether the claim was true or embellished, it hardly mattered. What mattered was that the knowledge passed hand to hand, one generation's patient instruction becoming the next generation's muscle memory. The geometry of proportion and the pressure of the blade against granite becoming as natural as breathing, the stelae themselves were no longer being raised on the grand scale of earlier centuries. There was no new monument to rival the great ones, but there was still steady work, grave markers for merchants of middling wealth, boundary stones for the larger farming estates, decorative lintels for the newer stone churches being built in villages that had not yet possessed one. The craft did not vanish. It contracted and redistributed, seeping into the ordinary fabric of highland life rather than serving the spectacular ambitions of empire. Jonas rarely thought about the contraction of trade routes or the growing Persian ships in the harbour at Adulis. Such things lived in the world of merchants and priests and administrators, in the world of correspondence and negotiation and rumour, and his world was made of stone and mallet strike and the slow emergence of form from formlessness. He was aware, in the way that any man is aware of distant weather, that the city felt quieter than it had in his father's time. Fewer caravans, fewer foreign voices in the market quarter. The smell of unfamiliar spices, which had once been a constant background note of the lower streets, came less frequently now and seemed more precious when it did arrive, as though it had travelled further to reach him. His apprentice was a boy of perhaps 15 named Dorrit, the son of a tanner from the lower quarter of the town, who had arrived one morning with nothing but an earnest expression and hands that were already, his uncle had noted approvingly, unusually steady. Dorrit was learning to see before he learned to cut. This was the first principle Jonas had taught him, the same one his own uncle had taught him decades before. You had to look at the stone until you understood what the stone was willing to give. Not every piece of granite would accept every form. The mineral had its own grain, its own invisible insistence, and a carver who ignored that insistence would spend his life fighting his material instead of working with it in the afternoons. When the mallet work was done for the day and the yard was dusted white and luminous in the slanted light, Jonas would sometimes sit with Dorrit and tell him about the inscriptions he had copied and the stories behind them, kings who had campaigned far to the south and west, bringing back tribute in ivory and living animals, priests who had composed long theological arguments in stone because they did not trust parchment to survive the centuries, merchants who had paid for modest monuments because even a modest monument in stone was a kind of permanence that wealth in gold could not quite buy. He told him about the old languages too, the geese that the church used, formal and ancient even to Jonas's ear, the older Ethiopic scripts that appeared on some of the PI Christian monuments, which Jonas could not read, but which a scholar priest had once told him were records of military campaigns and royal genealogies. He told him about the Greek letters that appeared occasionally on the oldest commercial stelae in Adulis, left there by traders who had passed through before either of them was born, and how those letters now seemed as remote and decorative as patterns of ornamental fine work. Their original meaning dissolved into pure visual texture. The city of Aksum itself, in these quieter years, had the character of a place that had decided to grow more inward rather than outward. The great market still operated. The cathedral of Miriam Sion still drew pilgrims from distant highlands on its feast days, and the smell of incense from its open doors drifted down the surrounding streets in slow, sweet ribbons of smoke. The priests still performed the ancient liturgy in geese, their voices rising and falling in patterns so old that no one could quite say when they had first been established, only that they had always been this way and would, God willing, continue to be this way long after any individual voice had stilled. The Ark of the Covenant, which the priests maintained was kept in a special sanctuary and which no ordinary person was permitted to approach or examine, remained the spiritual center around which all other Aksumite life quietly arranged itself. It was not discussed, exactly. It was present the way the mountain is present above a valley town, not always spoken of, rarely the subject of conversation, but never truly absent from awareness either. A gravitational certainty that oriented everything else without needing to announce itself. Jonas completed a grave marker that autumn for a woman who had been, her family said, a skilled weaver of the fine cotton cloth that Aksum still produced in quantity. Cloth whose whiteness was achieved through a laborious process of washing and pressing that required access to the cold, clean water of the highland streams. He carved her name into the stone in careful geese letters, and beneath the name he carved a small loom, his own addition, not requested, simply felt to be appropriate, worked in shadow relief so that the light would catch it differently depending on the hour of day. Her daughter, who came to inspect the work, stood before it for a long time without speaking. It was a small act, and an unremarkable one by the standards of the great commemorative tradition. But Jonas understood, in the way that craftsmen understand things without articulating them, that this was now the primary form of the tradition's survival, not in the great stelae that drew wonder from travelers, but in the accumulated weight of small, careful acts performed by ordinary hands in quiet yards, each one a thread in a fabric that required no single spectacular moment to hold together. The autumn rains came in time, soft and persistent, washing the stone dust from the yards, packed earth floor and filling the cistern at the edge of the property with clean water that caught the grey light of the overcast sky and held it with a kind of modest faithfulness. And somewhere to the north, the ships continued their patient work in the harbour, and the road between the sea and the highlands continued to carry its slow traffic of goods and news and rumour, and the kingdom continued its long, quiet conversation with its own persistence. In the 7th month of a year that carried no particular name in the records that survived, a caravan arrived at the edge of Aksum's lower market from a direction that few caravans still came from the north and west, following the old Nile corridor that had once been a royal highway and was now little more than a memory pressed into the red earth. The men who led it were not merchants in any ordinary sense. They carried goods, yes, bolts of undyed linen, stoppered clay jars sealed with dark wax, a small chest of copper ingots, but they moved with the deliberate, unhurried manner of people who had not come primarily to sell anything. Their robes were dust-colored from the road, their sandals one thing at the heel, and the led figure among them, a man of perhaps 50 years with a narrow beard and eyes that had grown accustomed to long distances, paused at the first sight of the city's remaining stelae and simply stood there for a long moment, looking upward. His name was Chudros. He had been born somewhere along the Atbara River, in a settlement that still used Aksumite coins as objects of ceremony rather than trade pressed into clay as decoration, offered at household shrines, held by the elderly as talismans of a world they had heard described but never seen. For Chudros, the city of Aksum had existed for most of his life as a kind of spoken architecture, something built entirely out of other people's words, and now here it stood before him in the amber light of late afternoon, smaller than the words had suggested, and also, in some way he could not immediately name, more real. The lower market received the caravan without ceremony. A few sellers of roasted grain glanced up, noted the dust on the newcomers' garments, assessed the likely value of the copper they carried, and returned to their conversations. A child ran alongside the led donkey for 30 paces before losing interest. The city absorbed the arrival the way a river absorbs a tributary, without pause, without comment. Simply continuing to flow, Chudros and his companions settled in the eastern quarter, in a compound kept by a widow named Eleni who let rooms to travelling traders and asked few questions. The compound had a fig tree at its center that had grown so old its roots had lifted the flagstones around it into gentle ridges, like waves frozen in stone. In the evenings, the men sat beneath it and spoke quietly, eating injera brought from the market, drinking the local tea from clay cups that left a faint honeyed residue on the rim. What they spoke of in those evenings is not recorded anywhere, and yet what they had witnessed along their journey southward can be pieced together from the general shape of the world they had crossed. The northern trade routes were changing again. The great merchant confederacies that had once organized the movement of goods from the Red Sea coast to the Upper Nile were fragmenting under the pressure of new powers moving down from the northeast. And the old Aksumite ports, Adulis chief among them, had not simply declined but had been, in the most recent generation, largely abandoned. The harbour that had once echoed with the languages of a dozen civilizations, where incense from the Arabian coast was exchanged for ivory from the deep interior, now held only salt air and the occasional fisherman's craft. The warehouses had become homes, and the homes had begun returning to earth. Chudros had seen this with his own eyes. He had passed through what remained of Adulis on his way south, and the image had stayed with him the way certain images do, not dramatically, not with the force of shock, but quietly, settling into the back of the mind like sediment settling into still water. He had stood where the great docking platforms once extended into the sea, and the stone had been warm under his hands, and the sea had been beautiful, and there had been no ships at all. In Aksum, however, there was a different kind of life continuing quieter, more turned inward, but continuous. The cathedral of Meriam Sion still held its daily offices, and the sound of chanting drifted down through the upper quarters each morning before sunrise. Weaving through the narrow paths between compounds, the way smoke weaves through branches. The priests still kept their records in geese, still trained young men in the reading of scripture, still maintained the careful, elaborate cycle of feast days that had structured Aksumite life for centuries. Whatever had contracted at the edges, this center still held. Tewodros found this worth noting. He had come, in part, because others in his community along the Atbara had begun to doubt that Aksum still stood in any meaningful sense, had begun to speak of it the way people speak of things that existed only in the past. He had been sent, or had sent himself, to see. And what he found was neither the empire of legend nor the ruin of rumor, but something more difficult to summarize, a city that had chosen, or been compelled, to become a different version of itself, and had done so without entirely losing the thread of what it had been. He spent several days in the market, trading his linen and his copper for highland spices and finely woven cloth, the kind of white cotton that Aksumite weavers still produced with remarkable skill despite everything. He spoke with other traders, with a deacon who passed through the market each afternoon distributing scripture readings to those who could not attend services, with an elderly woman who sold dried figs from a basket on her head and who remembered, she said, her own grandmother speaking of the days when the king's court received emissaries from across the sea. That grandmother's memory would have reached back perhaps a century, perhaps more, a long chain of spoken recollection stretching from the present moment back toward a time of different scale. Tewodros listened to her with the attention he gave to all things on this journey, steadily, without rushing her toward any conclusion. On his last evening in the city, he walked to the field of stelae alone, in the blue hour after sunset, when the sky holds its light longer than the earth does. The great obelisks rose around him in the dimness, their carved geometric patterns barely visible, their scale unchanged by the passing of centuries or the shrinking of the world around them. He could not read the inscriptions few living people could by that point, but he stood among them for a long time, and the stone was cool, and the air smelled of the highland evening, of dry grass and distant rain, and somewhere below the city, a dog barked once and fell silent. When he left Aksum the following morning, he took with him several bolts of white cotton, a small quantity of cardamom, and something harder to weigh, a revised sense of what continuity might look like when an empire does not so much fall as quietly learn to fit inside a smaller frame. The road north received him again, and the red dust rose around the feet of the donkeys, and the stelae were last to sight before he had gone very far at all. Further south, in the highlands beyond Aksum's immediate reach, other changes were already gathering, not sudden arrivals, but the slow accumulation of pressures that would, in another generation or two, begin to shift the center of highland life southward, toward new valleys and new names, carrying the thread of Aksumite culture with it like a loom carried from one house to another. The rains came late that year to the highland plateau, and when they finally arrived, they came not with the usual slow build of grey mornings and hesitant showers, but all at once, a single afternoon that darkened without warning, as though the sky had simply decided it had waited long enough. In the fields outside Aksum, where barley grew in terraced rows cut into the hillside by generations of labor before any living person could remember, farmers stood at the edges of their plots and tilted their faces upward with an expression that was neither quite relief nor quite worry, but something that lived quietly between the two. Among them was a woman named Miriam, who worked a small plot that her husband had cleared before he died of a fever 3 seasons past. She was not young, her hands knew the weight of a hoe as old friends know each other's silences, and she had watched many rains come and go over these hills. But late rains always carried with them a particular kind of tension, of recalculation of everything she had planned for the season, when to sow the second planting, when to expect the harvest, whether the granary would carry them through the following dry months if the yield came in thin. She did not panic, she simply adjusted, the way people do when they have no other choice. This chapter belongs to her, and to the land she worked, and to the rhythms of life that continued in and around the great city of Aksum in those long, slow centuries after the empire's brightest decades had faded, not dramatically, not with collapse or catastrophe, but with the patient, almost imperceptible settling of a stone into soft earth. The fields surrounding Aksum were not incidental to the city. They were, in many ways, the city's true foundation, older than the stelae, older than the cathedral, older than any of the monuments that travelers came from distant places to admire. The plateau's volcanic soil was dark and generous, and it had fed people here for a very long time. Wheat, barley, teff small, fine grain unlike anything grown in the lowlands, which made the flat, slightly sour bread that sat at the center of every meal. Lentils in their various colors. Garden plots beside houses where women grew fenugreek and rue and a small-leaved herb whose smell, when it was crushed between the fingers, could stop a person mid-step and carry them somewhere else entirely. The work of the fields followed its own calendar, parallel to but distinct from the liturgical calendar that governed the bells of the cathedral and the festivals in the streets. Both calendars mattered. Both shaped how a person understood time, but the agricultural one was older, and its demands were less negotiable. Miriam's day began before the light. She rose in the darkness of her single-room house, rekindled the cooking fire from the coals she had banked the night before, and set water to heat. The sound of the fire, a soft, sustained exhalation, was the first sound of every morning. Then the clink of a clay pot, the low sound of her own breathing. Outside, the stars were still present over the plateau, enormous and indifferent, and the air carried that particular chill of highland POE dawn that has nothing gentle about it. She ate standing up, a habit of the busy season, and then wrapped her length of undyed cotton cloth around her shoulders and walked out to the field. While the darkness was still only just beginning to release its hold, the terraces here were built from stone gathered across many generations, each course of rock fitted without mortar, but held by the weight and patience of everything laid above it. Walking beside them in the early morning, with the mist still lying low across the lower slopes, one might have had the impression of a landscape that had always looked exactly this way, that the walls had grown here the way rock outcrops grow, slowly and without intention. But of course, every stone had been placed by someone, and every terrace was a record of decisions made over time, where water gathered, where soil slipped, where a wall had failed and been rebuilt slightly differently. Miriam knew her terraces the way she knew her own hands. She could tell by the way the soil felt underfoot which sections had received enough moisture and which were still waiting. She could see, at a glance, where a small collapse in the retaining wall would need repair before the next heavy rain ran through it and took a season's planting with it. She carried a length of cord and a short-handled tool for moving soil, and she worked through the morning in near silence, tending to small problems before they became large ones. By midday, when the sun had climbed high enough to draw sweat, she stopped and sat in the shade of a large fig tree that stood at the edge of the upper terrace. This tree was old, genuinely, visibly old, with a trunk that had long since stopped growing upward and was instead spreading outward. It barked like the skin of something that had decided it was finished with ambition and content now simply to endure. Under this tree she ate bread and a small portion of dried lentils, and drank from a clay flask that she refilled each morning from the cistern near the house. Below her, the city of Aksum lay spread across its several hills, its streets quieter in the midday heat. The great stelae were visible from here, those tall stone towers standing in their field as they had always stood, offering no explanation for themselves, absorbing the light of the sun without giving any of it back. Miriam did not think about them much. They were simply part of the landscape she had grown up inside, present and permanent, and not requiring any particular thought. She knew, because the priests had said so, and because the old people of the neighborhood had said so before them, that the towers were very old, older than the church, older than the grandparents of anyone's grandparents. But this knowledge sat lightly in her. What occupied her attention was the wall section on the lower terrace, which had begun to lean, and the question of whether the second planting of barley should go in this week, or wait another 10 days for the soil to settle after the rain. These were the real questions of her life, and they were not small ones. In the late afternoon, as the light turned the color of old honey across the plateau, she walked back toward the city along a path that cut between two other families' plots. She passed a neighbor repairing a wooden yoke, his movements careful and absorbed. She passed two children carrying a basket of something heavy between them, their arms straining, their conversation apparently more interesting than their burden. She passed the smell of someone's cooking fire, and the distant, winding sound of a priest's chant rising from somewhere inside the cathedral quarter. The city received her back without ceremony, which was exactly how she preferred it. There would be more rain tomorrow, she thought. The clouds that had built along the western horizon carried a certain heaviness that she had learned, over many years, to read accurately. She would need to clear the drainage channel along the upper terrace before it blocked. She would need to check the granary's roof, where one of the cross beams had shown signs of damp at the end of last season. She walked home through streets that smelled of wet stone and cooking fat and the faint, sweet rot of overripe figs fallen from trees overhanging garden walls. A donkey stood motionless near a doorway, patient in the way that donkeys have always been patient, as though they have made a private peace with the nature of time that no other creature has quite managed. Inside her house, she set the fire going again, and the light shifted, and the evening came down over the plateau with its usual unhurried thoroughness. In the coming seasons, the rains would be neither consistently generous nor consistently harsh. The harvest would be adequate, not a year to remember for abundance, nor one to remember for hardship. Miriam would repair the terrace wall. She would adjust her plantings as the conditions required. She would continue, which is a form of achievement that history rarely records and rarely needs to. But the land would remember. The terraces she maintained would stand, reshaped by other hands in other generations, long after everything else about this particular life had passed beyond recovery.